Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Russia-Ukraine dialogue. Today, we'll be focusing on negotiating with Putin. Recently, Ukraine's President Zelensky said that while any war should be ended at the negotiation table, the position for victory must be achieved on the battlefield. He also stated, and I quote, "Independence, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most of our people, is regaining all of our territories, restoring all of our territorial integrity and inviolable sovereignty of Ukraine." Now, Zelensky is not alone. According to a recent poll, approximately 82% of Ukrainians are opposed to any territorial concessions. Negotiation, as suggested by the earlier Zelensky quote, is only one of many tools of conflict resolution, but certainly an important one. To explore negotiations in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war, I'd like to welcome two very distinguished guests. Firstly, Elizabeth Hume. She is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, an organization that brings together a network of over 160 organizations working in 181 countries. Liz is a conflict resolution expert, and has more than 20 years of experience in senior leadership positions in bilateral, multilateral institutions and NGOs. She has extensive experience in policy and advocacy and overseeing sizable and complex peacebuilding programs in conflict-affected and fragile states in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. I should also add that in 2004, Liz helped to establish the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID, and she has a lot of experience on implementation of peace agreements in the Balkans. Liz, welcome. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Professor Robert Mnookin. He is the Samuel Williston Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project, and for over 25 years chaired the prestigious program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. Professor Mnookin has applied his interdisciplinary approach to negotiation and conflict resolution to a remarkable range of problems, both public and private. He's an experienced mediator, and in addition to serving as a neutral, in addition, he has served as a neutral in a number of high-stake commercial disputes. Welcome, Professor. I'm going to turn first to you, Liz. I would like you to give us a little bit of a scene setter. What has happened so far on the negotiation front? Thank you, Liz.
So thank you. So and thank you for inviting me. This is a really important topic. And it's, when we talked about it earlier, this is an incredibly difficult conflict. And thinking about how it's going to end and how to work on it. So I can't even pretend to say that, any of us really know what's going to happen. But the best thing to do is look at what has happened so far. And unfortunately, not a lot when it comes to current negotiations. And partly because the Kremlin has not yet shown any real readiness to engage. There is no evidence that Putin really wants an off-ramp. And he, his war aims while they have shrunk, some of the demands that we know about in the East, Ukraine has said are off the table. So, he also, speaks of the past and about Ukraine and, looking to create a mini Soviet Union. So, negotiations are incredibly difficult when you're so far apart. And negotiations to date have been really scattershot. A lot of shuttle diplomacy with interlocutors like Turkey, Israel, France, having calls going back and forth. But there have been no confidence building measures, and any agreements that have been made about ceasefires or allowing a humanitarian corridor have all been violated. So, and then, we go back, even initial talks that were held in Belarus, they were not productive. Senior people from Russia weren't sent. And, there were reports, we don't know how true this is, that, people who left got ill. And so, we do know Russia has poisoned people before. So this has obviously had a chilling effect. It'd be hard to want to go and sit at a negotiating table. So I think, I'll stop there because that's really the scene setter. And to say this is a difficult negotiation, I know we're going to get into some of the scenarios, is to speak lightly. This is one of the hardest conflicts that I've known in my lifetime.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And thanks for mentioning the poison incident also, because I do think it serves as an analogy for the difficulty of these negotiations. And I'm gonna turn to you, Bob, now, and you can start to put your slide on the screen. But I'd like to mention to our audience while he's getting ready that I'm very excited about his participation, because I've used a number of his books and articles for my own research, and I've been thinking regularly about a specific book that he published in recent years called Bargaining with the Devil, where he explored many of the key issues when we need to think about in negotiating with people who we think about as unspeakable, who have committed unspeakable atrocities with a lot of blood on their hands. One of the key things that I've learned from Bob is that it's not always a matter of whether we should negotiate with these so-called devils, but sometimes we don't have a choice. So I've asked him to help us map out a little bit about some of the issues that we need to think about in engaging Putin, the main goals, and also in the jargon of negotiation theory, what is the BATNA of both parties, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So Bob, I'll give the floor to you, and thank you for those opening remarks, Liz.
Well, Liz is entirely right. This is a conflict from hell. It's a very, very difficult conflict indeed. And in fact, I had a dream a few weeks ago, and that is that President Zelensky called me for negotiation advice. And somehow he had read the book Bargaining with the Devil. And I have to confess that if I ask myself the question, does Putin qualify as a devil? I think he does. I don't believe in a devil literally, but in my book, I define a devil as an adversary who has or may hurt you, someone you don't trust, someone you may feel is evil. And I think Putin is evil. I think he has shown a willingness to intentionally inflict grievous harm on human beings without adequate justification. And so what the book addresses is a question, and that is, should you be prepared to negotiate with the devil? And I think that my own answer to the question in terms of an elevator speech is not always, but more often you feel like it. And the reason you're not going to feel like it is because first, a number of negative traps and strong emotions make you want to fight, even when a clear-headed analysis might demonstrate that perhaps you should negotiate. A second reason, which also applies in this context, relates to morality and legitimacy. Any deal with an evil adversary that's going to be made means that the adversary will necessarily also somehow benefit. And that may well violate some of your moral principles. So in the book, I have Mr. Spock, a Vulcan, kind of go through as the consummate rational actor to sort of think through logically and with strict emotional mastery how you decide whether to negotiate. And what the framework does is essentially explicitly evaluate the best one can, the potential costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. And there are a number of rather straightforward questions that Mr. Spock asks. They're not easy to answer. There's always a lot of uncertainty. You're having to make a lot of predictability. And as I indicated, there are considerations of legitimacy and morality that also pose rather profound philosophical issues. Should Zelensky enter into peace negotiations with this devil? My answer is ultimately the answer has to be yes. I hope that it comes sooner rather than later, but it's not clear that's true. Let me just spend a couple minutes going through what is in fact thinking about the kinds of questions that my Mr. Spock would ask. A first question is, what Mr. Spock requires you to do is you've really got to try to get into the head of your counterpart on the other side. And we've got to ask ourselves, what's Putin's perspective on this conflict? I think the thing we have to realize is that politically, Ukraine was part of Russia for a couple hundred years. My great-grandfather emigrated to the United States, and my grandfather always claimed that he was born in Russia. Well, it turns out he was really born in the Ukraine, but particularly in the 19th century, for someone of Jewish heritage living in the Ukraine, they viewed themselves as part of the Russian Empire. And Putin seized Ukraine as a geographic region that was long part of Russia, really from the time of Catherine the Great in the 18th century until the collapse of the Soviet Union with a very brief interregnum. Ukraine was part of Russia. And he sees that region as essentially part of the greater Russian family. Putin wrote an essay, a long essay in July of last year, quote, on the historical unity of Russia and the Ukraine. The second issue goes to religion. The Orthodox religion is linked to national identity, and nearly 70% of Ukrainians identify with a strand of Orthodox Christianity. And there have been historically extremely close ties between the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and those in Russia. And it was really only in 2019 that the Ukrainian Church broke away. And the notion of unity, in fact, is driven in part because churchmen in Kiev and Moscow talk about, it may have been mythical, the baptism of a Viking warlord in the 10th century of the Rus tribe. The third part of his mindset has to do with ethnicity. Many Ukrainians ethnically identify themselves as Russians. The estimate is roughly 20% in 1921. More importantly, in terms of language, Ukraine is full of Russian speakers. Perhaps 40% of Ukrainians speak Russian in the home. And these people are native Russian speakers. Many more understand Russian. And Ukraine, in fact, today is deeply and fundamentally bilingual. Yale professor Timothy Snyder said, basically everybody still speaks both languages. In a sense, Putin has viewed himself as protecting these Russian speakers from forced assimilation and oppression. He somehow believes that to some extent he's perhaps there to liberate the Russians of Ukraine, and he's involved in an irredentist project of some sort. In Snyder's words, Ukraine's status is very central to ideas of Russian greatness. Putin sees Ukraine as having this strategic but also semi-mystical relationship to Russia. What are Putin's core interests? I think Putin's number one interest, of course, is to remain in power. And he wants to augment his reputation as a great Russian leader. I think he wants to restore Russia's prestige as a great power. And he's extremely interested, of course, in Russian national security. Putin's war aims is his initial war aim was clear. He wanted to replace the Ukrainian government and bind Ukraine to Russia, probably by installing some kind of puppet. He wants to guarantee long-term control of Crimea and Black Sea access. He wants to annex the eastern provinces, and he wants to protect ethnic Russians and the importance of the Russian language within Ukraine. I'm going to spend just a minute on Zelensky's core interests. Zelensky's core interest is, first of all, to preserve Ukraine's independence as a sovereign liberal state. He, of course, wants to end the bloodshed and destruction, and he wants to promote the economic and social development of his nation. And he wants to retain the Donbass region. And he also has stated that he aspires to regaining a Crimea. So I think that having identified the interests of both parties, what Mr. Spock next asks is a very basic fundamental question. He'd ask each party, well, if you can't reach a negotiated agreement that serves your interests, what are your alternatives? And I think for both of them, that the answer to what their best alternative to a negotiated agreement is to keep on fighting. Neither wants to give up. So I guess that's the situation we're in, where it's reasonably straightforward to identify the perspective and interests of both parties. On the other hand, as Liz indicated, there's been really no movement towards serious negotiations yet. And the stated positions of both parties are really presently quite irreconcilable.
Thank you, Bob. I think that gives us a lot of food for thought to continue to the rest of our discussion. And I'm very grateful that you also laid out some of the, what you and some of your colleagues might call the pictures in the head of Putin, because those are really important to understand, for some of the potential negotiators, but also some of the interest that you laid out from both parties, because Zelensky also has a number of competing interests that he has to think about when engaging his adversary. Liz, I don't know if you maybe want to comment on some of those issues that Bob highlighted, and perhaps I think my main question for you would also be if you could provide us with some scenarios of possible negotiated outcomes if we move into some form of negotiation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. A lot of people have asked me this, and I know I've asked a lot of people. One of the things that I think is off the table right now, or at least the probability has gone down, was sort of this, World War III or nuclear war, which I think people were very terrified in the beginning. And I know I'm a Gen Xer, so I grew up before the wall fell, and folks have, in my cohort, it's something that we were really talking about. And I think that's probably gone down. However, Putin has made just recently, as the US and Sweden, who thought Sweden would be sending arms, that we, that threat is going up a bit. And that's something we still need to have in the mix, that this could become incredibly volatile still. And I think that that's something that's really important for us to keep on the table. But as Bob said, most wars come to an end through negotiations. One side loses, the attacker gives up, they withdraw. And most wars end with parties negotiating a settlement. But there's also low-level conflicts that go on for decades. And many we just forget about. I mean, the Casamance, for example, in Africa was one of the longest running civil wars. So that does also happen. But how the war goes in Ukraine we have to look at, or how it gets negotiated, how it ends, looking at two things. And I think Bob talked about these. What were the demands? You know, what are the demands on each side, and how the war is going. In Bosnia, for example, the Serbs came to the table because NATO was significantly bombing Serb infrastructure, and, you know, allowed for the Bosniaks to be on the move in Bosnia. I don't think that's going to happen here. I don't think that while Russian forces have performed terribly, they're still, you know, and they're regrouping in the East. I don't see an all-out win or Russia feeling like, you know, they're being defeated. You know, their demands have come down from the denazification and the complete takeover of Ukraine, but their demands really are firm on Crimea being recognized as part of Russia. And, you know, if you look to the past, you know, they've been very clear that that's off the table. And they're really looking to the East, and they've regrouped. And if, you know, this might be the face saving that people talk about that Putin needs. But again, you know, looking to the past, if that's where they're going, then Ukraine would have to give up the East. And that would be incredibly difficult for them. At the same time, I think we really have to stop and think about what is happening in Ukraine. The destruction, the death, the amount of refugees and IDPs, you know, this is on a scale, again, that we have not seen, you know, since World War II. And, you know, in Europe, this is shocking. And you have to think about at what point, you know, how do people survive? And I think that that's a really important question, you know, or if you win, but everything is lost, well, then what did you win? But again, you know, formally acknowledging that the East is part of Russia would, you know, create incredible political backlash. And it's important to remember that Ukraine is united now against a common enemy. But prior to the war, Zelensky's approval rating was low. There's many factions in Ukraine. You know, so it's not this, you know, it wasn't this incredibly cohesive state. But Ukraine has also put out a lot of good, you know, as Bob said, a lot of good offers, remaining, you know, saying they'll remain a neutral state, not joining NATO, you know, not developing nuclear weapons, looking at, you know, looking at discussing Crimea 15 years down the road. So those are some of the things that they have put on the table. And I also think it's important to understand, I know Bob called Putin the devil, and, you know, in the beginning, and I agree with that, many people have thought about Putin as crazy, and I don't think he is. Withdrawing from Kiev and hunkering down in the East, you know, is a good strategy. Coupled with the fact, given how the West and NATO acted when he invaded Crimea, or, you know, what happened in Syria, it was pretty reasonable for him to expect, and especially the way the past US administration dealt with Russia and Ukraine in the US, is pretty reasonable to expect that, you know, we weren't going to have a robust response. So I think that that's also important to remember, that I don't think Putin is necessarily, crazy as folks have said. But I think really important with this negotiation is to understand that this is up to Ukraine of what they decide they can do, but also remember that NATO is a party to this conflict. We are supplying incredible amount of weapons. We have put incredible amount of unprecedented sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. We are part of the conflict. And we will also have to make concessions thinking about what happens because we have really focused in on destroying their economy. And that will have to be on the table. But how does the U.S., I go back and I think about when we have gotten to this point with another country, what have we done? Have we let it go? You don't have to go, far back and look at Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi in Libya. And so, I call it kind of the point of no return, where the U.S. will not, you're done in our eyes. So that I think is an important thing to think about where we are in this process. But also, how do you negotiate? And this is Bob's point, with the devil, with somebody who has created or has conducted atrocities and war crimes. And I have to say, what Ukraine has done is brilliant in the fact that they have not waited, like in Bosnia and other places, to after the fact to look at the evidence of war crimes. They are being incredibly careful. They are documenting it. They are actually going after people in real time in terms of war crimes. And that is the new precedent. And I think something that's really important moving forward. I just want to say, whatever happens, and if there is a negotiation, we also have to be really clear. I don't think Russia, they might comply for a little while, but any ceasefire would be temporary. Maybe only lasting as long for the Russian army to regroup, rearm, start again, because Putin has made it clear that destroying Ukraine is his goal. And we don't have any evidence really that he's abandoned that. So I think that that's a really important piece of, are we doing something temporarily? And understanding that in the beginning, there was a big push, hopefully, that, Putin would be toppled, which is why we went after the warlord, the oligarchs. However, we don't have any evidence that that's the case. So I think that, ultimately there will be some sort of negotiation. I don't think it will hold long. And, we will also have to really look at Ukraine after the fact and provide assistance, focusing in on rebuilding Ukraine as well, so that it doesn't fall apart from within. So I'll stop there. And like I said, there's no good answers. So, we are all speculating here.
Thank you, Liz. No, I think there's also some interesting points that you raise. And I do want to make clear, even if I or, if Bob classifies someone as the devil, it doesn't mean that person is irrational necessarily or crazy or anything like that. It strictly has to do with the, the acts that person commits, which makes it hard for us to negotiate with that individual, because we are brought up with the idea that we should not negotiate with the devil, right? So, but I think you've raised a number of really important points. There are major obstacles that would make it very hard to negotiate, not just negotiate, but negotiate an end to this conflict. And you brought up Bosnia in particular, and I think there were at least 33 agreements, peace agreements in place during the Bosnian War until Holbrooke negotiated. I think the 34th one which then led to the Dayton peace process, which then ended the war, but set up something really, kind of difficult to push the country into a new direction. But we'll get back to that issue. But I think some of the issues that you mentioned are important in terms of thinking about conflict ripeness. And Bob, this is where I want to bring you back into the conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about what is conflict ripeness, and with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war, what are some of the key factors that will determine conflict ripeness? Over to you, Bob.
Well, I think that, first of all, I 100% agree and believe that someone can be evil but perfectly rational. That is, they can have evil ends and be willing to use evil means, but very rationally calculate what they're going to do. Now, in fact, I think Putin seriously miscalculated. I mean, he underestimated Ukrainian resistance. I think he seriously underestimated the NATO response, which I think Biden and the international press, in my view, get enormous credit for creating a degree of solidarity within NATO and Europe that is quite remarkable. And I also say, I agree with Liz that, of course, NATO and our Western allies all have a stake in this, particularly those in Europe. You know, broadly speaking, I think a talk of victory on either side is crazy talk. I don't think, at least in the shorter intermediate run, Russia is going to be able to topple the Ukrainian government and install a puppet. I think occupying a country as large, as populated as Ukraine is just a humongous task, which I don't think Putin really would look forward to. On the other hand, I think a Russian defeat, withdrawal and humiliation isn't in the cards either. I mean, Russia is a country so much larger than the Ukraine, and they have reserves of possible soldiers that can be called up, and they have the economic means to pursue this war for a long time. And I think the most likely outcome now, right now, is what's sometimes called a herding stalemate. And that is, there's going to be a protracted armed conflict where there are going to be incremental changes on what happens on the ground. But it's unlikely that either side is going to get any kind of victory, but it's going to be a grinding war, which of course is inflicting, as Liz suggested, just devastating effects on the Ukrainian economy, on its people. The number of refugees is simply stunning. And I think that the issue of when in fact things are ripe, I actually think that theories of ripeness are kind of conclusory. You know, after the fact, once people get down to negotiate and make a deal, people say, oh, it was ripe. But predicting when it's ripe is very hard to do because it really depends on the behavior of the two sides and their expectations of what's to come. And each side wants to signal to the other that they've got a lot of staying power and that they haven't given up their aims. And in this process, each tends to somewhat exaggerate their staying power. But I think that what ripeness really involves is, well, when are they going to get, when in fact are each prepared to make concessions that might lead to a genuine ceasefire? I think Liz's caution that a ceasefire is not the end of the is not necessarily the end of the conflict. You can see this just from the, quote, civil war in the eastern region of Ukraine. There was something, Liz probably knows the exact number, I don't, but there were something like 20 ceasefires in Ukraine itself. between Russia and the Ukrainian government. And there's a big difference between a ceasefire that's really permanent and, you know, sort of what can often be strategic short cessation of conflict. I actually believe that there is a deal. And it's not clear that either side would be prepared to accept the deal, but at an appropriate time, and I don't say this that it should be right now, Leon, but I'd be glad to sort of very briefly outline the deal. Because I think that the terrible paradox in my mind is, I think I know where this is going to end up. When there finally is a resolution, I think we can predict right now what it's going to involve. And it's going to be very hard to reach it. And if you ask me when it's going to happen, I don't know. And it may be that it's never going to happen and there's just going to be a grinding conflict for years and years and years. But I actually do see a deal that would serve the interests of both sides better than the continued conflict. Now, whether it could be implemented, you know, and how soon it would come, I can't say.
Thank you,
and
Bob.
I think most people know it. And I think the other point that I hope we come back to, it is not up to the West to impose this deal on Ukraine. I'm very worried about that. And the West has a lot of leverage, because without the support of the United States and the NATO allies, Ukraine can't keep up the fight for all that long. And what I worry about is that Western resolve, you know, gets exhausted, that Europe gets tired of having so many refugees, et cetera, and that Russia manages to keep going, notwithstanding these economic sanctions.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I think those are great points. Liz, I'm going to ask you actually about both of those issues. I'll first ask you the first one. So before you respond to the second one, I'll ask you as kind of an additional question based on the point that Bob raised. So let me first ask you the first one. Now, it seems like there is this consensus developing in Washington, D.C. that Ukraine has to, quote unquote, win and Putin has to be defeated. And I saw a recent kind of call from a number of think tankers in Washington, D.C. who made this point also. And at the same time, a number of European leaders are making the same point, not all of them. Estonia's president, for example, is using similar language. What does that mean? And will NATO and our allies develop a long-term strategy that will ultimately support Ukraine in a manner that it could get a good deal at the negotiation table? What would that entail?
So you're absolutely right. That is, and in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a big push on the fact that Russia has to be defeated. I agree with Bob. I don't see how that happens without the U.S. or NATO entering the war. And, you know, at some point, you know, we are dancing with the devil, right? And at some point, there's going to be a trigger where Putin, you know, is going to maybe, you know, not just reminding us that he has nuclear weapons. So there's that's a really tight rope to be on, because Bob is absolutely right. Yeah.
Excuse me 1 minute.
Yeah.
I think the recent op-ed by President Biden, I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
And is quite different. I do not think the United States policy today has anything to do with
no, but what I'm saying, I agree, but right now there has been a lot of rhetoric coming out of Washington with think tanks and folks saying that that's what we have to do.
You're quite right.
Yeah,
There's
so that, no, I agree.
I think though that, and the president has made some unfortunate statements.
That's right, that's right.
But I don't think that is really the present policy. And the evidence I would cite is really quite a remarkable op-ed, which was in the New York Times by the president.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And like I said, that would require us to get into the war. And it has been, everything the US has done or NATO has done is to stay out of the war, stay out, right? Directly in the war. So I think that's a really important piece. My fear, though, is a lot of people are saber rattling, I guess, and making the case for it. And I think, Leon, that's what you were kind of alluding to. And it's just not going to happen because Russia is not, also North Korea. We can't make them a pariah state. If we can't defeat them militarily, we can't also destroy them economically. And, you pointed that out well. I mean, this is still a pretty big economy that, is able to withstand a lot. At the same time, can the West? We have incredible rising inflation, oil prices are through the roof. How much stamina do we have? And so there's a way that Russia can also wait us out a bit. And I think that's what they're trying to do. I think that, but at the end of the day, you had a country invade a democratic country, and there are serious atrocities committed. So again, that's what we're trying to balance. So I think that, what we've talked about is you will go into this somewhat stalemate. And we also have to remember that Ukraine was involved in a war with Russia prior to this. In the East, they were in a cyber war with Russia. So there was a lot going on prior to the invasion, the recent invasion. So, that's where we are right now. Washington is, balancing, sending enough, or NATO is sending enough weapons without getting us into a nuclear war, staying the course so it's enough. So, as Bob says, can we get to this ripeness of, where we can make some negotiated settlement? These are all the questions, but I will say, if anything, it has taught us some really serious lessons. And I don't know how many more times the international community has to be taught this. Prevention, prevention, and prevention. And what would have happened if we had applied sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine? If we had not just been kicking all of these things, kicking the can down the road. And I agree, Putin completely miscalculated what the West response was going to be, but I think a reasonable person could have made the assumption that we were just going to let it go again. And so I think that's really an important piece here, is that we have to make sure that, once this somewhat gets resolved, we cannot shy away from prevention. And I just also want to say that, this is all happening when the global, we are at a 30-year high in global violent conflict, even before Ukraine. Over 80 million refugees. This number has not been seen since World War II. What is happening in Ukraine is having an incredible knock-on effect globally with food crisis. We are going to see other fragile states we're already seeing them becoming incredibly impacted by the conflict in Ukraine. And all of this is happening as democracy has been backsliding and surging populism. So we also need to think about, this isn't happening, Ukraine isn't happening in a vacuum. And this war is having, many global consequences.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Liz. So basically, one of the things that you mentioned is, of course, it will be impossible to quote unquote defeat Putin completely. I think that's quite clear. But of course, there are other things that we can do, like as we've been supplying weapons to Ukraine. We've also imposed sanctions against Russia. So we can do those things that would make it, that would mean that Ukraine would be a stronger party at the negotiation table. Mm-hmm. Now, Bob earlier mentioned that we have to be careful not to push Ukraine too far in accepting any deal, because any deal is not a good deal. And you have a lot of experience, Liz, with your work from the Balkans. Can you maybe just tell us about how important it is to not just push Ukraine too far in accepting any deal?
Oh, 100%. Because that's what we saw in the Balkans. You know, you had your three leaders, you know, go to an airport hangar in Dayton, and they couldn't come out until they agreed. And, you know, I spent years in Bosnia trying to implement the Dayton Peace Accord. And, you know, we say it stopped the war, but, you know, as of today, you know, it is a very fragile peace. So, you know, what do you do? What do you look at? First of all, it can't also just be between Putin and Zelensky. You're going to have, you know, different parties from within Ukraine, for example. You know, we know that you're going to have a lot of other stakeholders there. You know, people that have been impacted by the conflict. And, you know, even though Colombia's peace agreement is not, you know, going exceptionally well, there is a lot there to look at. And the agreement, you know, because we're going to have a Marshall Plan or something for after the fact. And that's going to be a really important piece for Ukraine. What are we going to do about reconciliation? How are we going to address drivers of conflict that were in Ukraine? There's going to have to be, you know, it's again, you know, we look at things as we sign the document, people walk away, it gets implemented. There's going to have to be so much work done, you know, to after the fact for Ukraine, because it's going to get, I think it's going to get a lot worse for Ukraine before it gets better. Or before it stops. So I think that's, you know, there's a lot that we have learned on peace agreements. However, we also still make a lot of the same mistakes. So I think those are some of the main points.
Thank you, Liz. Bob, I'm going to turn back to you. Earlier, you mentioned that you have some ideas of what a possible deal could look like. And I just want to kind of add a little question here related to that from one of our audience members who's asking about, you know, that comment that Henry Kissinger recently made about Ukraine, in which he said that Ukraine should cede some of its territory to Russia, such as Donbass and so on. Do you think that should be part of a deal? And what's the type of deal that you envision that could be possible, and under what circumstances, perhaps?
The short answer is yes. And let me just sketch what I think many people recognize would be the ultimate shape of any deal that were negotiated. And then I think we can talk about all the problems of both implementation and the legitimacy of the deal. I'm going to very briefly share my screen again, if I can. First, I think a potential deal is going to involve some sort of territorial division. And the one that I envision would be to internationally acknowledge that Crimea is part of Russia. And I think in the Donbass region, what I would recommend and this I think is the best that the Ukrainians could hope for, is that there be an internationally supervised referendum to decide whether it would become part of Russia or instead remain formally part of Ukraine, but in perhaps a more federated state. Now, I think the other elements of the deal, let me just sort of briefly outline them too. Is first, it's indispensable that Ukraine remains an independent sovereign state and that Russia recognize this, that Ukraine is allowed to have its own internal political system. It's going to pledge, of course, it's already acknowledged that it would do this, that it would never be part of NATO. It would be neutral and unaligned. I think as part of the deal, Ukraine should be admitted to the EU so that they could be affiliated with the EU and that there would be some sense of Finlandization. And that is the notion that in terms of the East-West conflict, although it would be part of the EU and a democracy, it would not be aligned formally with the West militarily. As I said, Crimea would be recognized as part of Russia, and the Donbass region would involve a possible Russian annexation. I would have it depend on a referendum. A worse deal for Ukraine would be where there isn't a referendum, but it's simply ceded based on the facts on the ground to Russia. I think additional deal terms would be the Russian troops would be removed from Ukraine and the economic sanctions on Russia would be removed as this happens. And that I would, if I were advising the Ukrainian president, suggest that as a sweetener, Russia would again become an official language in Ukraine along with, of course, Ukrainian. Now, I think the tough issues, it's easy to imagine this deal. And of course, the one question is whether within Ukraine, if they were a national referendum, the kind of deal I'm outlining would be accepted by a majority of Ukrainians. And the answer is, I don't know. And I think the one thing that we know from the Colombian experience is we can't make facile assumptions that because a group of peacemakers think they worked out a great deal. And I applaud those involved in the deal between the Colombian government and the FARC. They didn't manage the internal politics very well because, as you recall, the initial referendum was turned down, and B, its implementation has been very, very spotty and very complicated. And then, of course, finally, there are these questions of legitimacy and morality. The deal I'm outlining rewards Putin for his aggression. That's pretty infuriating. It's really outrageous because he certainly violated international norms by invading Ukraine. On the other hand, I think I deeply believe that the West's role in all this is going to be extremely delicate because to push Ukraine into making these territorial concessions, which would be involved in what I see as the deal. I agree with Kissinger as to where this is likely to end up, but it smells an awful lot like Munich, where, of course, France and England and the West essentially agreed to carve up Czechoslovakia, where the Czechs weren't even at the table. And I think the immorality of that, is part of the Western memory. And so I think we've got to recognize that. And the pressure to do this, you know, the rhetoric, I hate the rhetoric of victory. You know, the West is going to displace Putin. I also, although I in many ways admire him in other respects, I think Macron's rhetoric in the last 2 days worries the hell out of me, because I think he's a little too eager to get involved as a peacemaker, where I sort of sniff a willingness to pressure Ukraine in a way that I think both weakens their position at the bargaining table, and I think in some ways is illegitimate. Because the Ukrainians, of course, are the ones paying the big price for resistance.
Thank you, Bob. Those are really interesting points. I just want to remind our audience also that that's not the ideal peace deal that you put forward. You were talking about the facts on the ground right now, because the facts on the ground often determine what a peace deal would look like. The other issue is that you highlighted is this issue of implementation. And of course, you know, in negotiations, we often refer to Putnam's idea about a two-level game. You know, it's one thing negotiating an agreement between two governments or two adversaries, but it's quite another thing selling that deal to your local population. And I started off this discussion by saying over 80% of Ukrainians, according to a recent poll, will not accept any territorial concessions. So this is not an ideal peace deal by any measure. Liz, I don't know if you would like to comment on some of these issues also, and then since Bob brought in Macron here, and we've heard Macron saying a few times, let's give Putin an off-ramp. Could you talk to us also about possible mediators? Who do you think is in a good place to mediate a possible agreement if we get to that stage? Thank you, Liz.
So I agree, Macron is not the best mediator. And again, you look at, when I talk about rising populism, you look at what the French elections just showed us, that Le Pen is, you know, gained. You know, that's not, you know, the best negotiator. You know, if you had to ask me who, probably, I mean, I guess think about maybe going up into the Scandinavian countries, although, you know, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, or talking about joining NATO, but definitely a country that is not going to be thinking about their own internal politics. And that, I think, is what would be happening with France. So I think that's, you know, that's where we have to probably be looking. You know, we've talked about, you know, the conflict and the impact it's had on people. And we've talked a lot about looking at past, looking at theory, looking at, but it is really important to understand that people in Ukraine are experiencing significant conflict. And we know our brains look differently when they're on conflict. You know, we know this from MRIs. So we also have to think about it, you know, the people in Colombia, you know, who would turn down a peace agreement? But, you know, we also have to think about that this is not, you know, this is not, you know, what you would be doing in the United States or in France is much different from when you're on the ground. And I just want to say, I agree with Bob. I think that that's where we're going to end up, but it's not going to be the end of it. Like I said, Russia will continue. You'll have these, you know, low-level skirmishes that we were having before. You'll have incredible cyber attacks. Russia is the king of dis and misinformation. I also want to give a shout out to the United States intel community. We've always struggled with how to respond to Russia and their dis and misinformation. Well, we found a really good way to do it, and that was the truth. And actually releasing intel in advance and saying, this is what they're going to do. So there's a lot of lessons pulling out of this. And one of the things that's going to be very important is how do we apply those lessons to other places as well, whether it's the disinformation, the cyber attacks, thinking about atrocity prevention and not waiting till after the fact to look at it. You know, there's a lot of lessons that are coming out of this. And, you know, I can't say enough, while what's happening in Ukraine is terrible and destructive and has incredible geopolitical impact, we also have to be looking at the conflicts that are happening globally, because like I said, we were at a 30-year high already in global violent conflict, and the impacts, especially from food security, the energy crisis, is only going to make things worse. And this is already on top of the global pandemic. So it's, you know, it is a really tough time for, you know, global geopolitical, what's happening, you know, with regard, you know, at the same time, surging populism here, even in the United States. So it's, you know, all I can say is prevention, prevention, prevention. We need to pivot to a conflict prevention global framework.
Yeah, I think some of the underlying things that you also pointed out is that we have to be careful because of the populism in some Western countries. Also, our unity may not be sustained over a long period of time, which of course will have, I think, a fundamental impact on the negotiations also, which is a factor we have to keep in mind. And therefore, I presume also some of the pessimism in the scenario that Bob, you put forward. Now,
although it did bring us a little bit together, it's the one thing that has, I think, helped unify Americans a bit more. So that
for now, but the
so
question
is actually, yeah,
in the long run, and the same within the EU and with regards to our other allies. The question is for how long, and it is an important factor to keep in mind when developing a negotiation strategy, you know, for Zelensky's team, of course. Now, Bob, let's turn back to you again. You've written a lot about negotiating with the devil, how to negotiate with the devil, and you've looked at a variety of case studies of prominent individuals who were faced with that question. But you also, I should add, this incredible project with two of your colleagues at PON, where you have interviewed every single living Secretary of State in the US and talked to them. Also, you specifically asked them questions about, well, when you negotiated with Putin, how did you do it? So share with us some of your wisdom, please.
Well, I think that I don't have any special wisdom, but I think that they all indicated, first, Putin is very intelligent. Second, none of them were suggesting that Putin is crazy. Third, they all emphasized his KGB background and his ideological commitment in kind of Russian greatness, the importance of Mother Russia, his commitment to restoring Russia to its greatness. They underscored that in Putin's mind, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the great tragedy of the 20th century. And finally, they indicated how I don't want to use the word paranoid, but how defensively oriented Russia and the Soviet Union have been, particularly because of the incredibly traumatic effects of World War II. One of our secretaries told this story of Putin indicating how in St. Petersburg, his father discovered his mother's body after a bombing attack where she was presumed dead, and he rescued her. And this is part of Putin's family historical memory. So I think that all of those things are quite relevant. But none of them, they were all too wise to think that there were any kind of special tricks that you could use with Putin. But being prepared and trying to, as best one can, understand the man is terribly important.
So one thing that is fundamental to a lot of negotiations is the issue of trust, Bob. But it's not. There are examples of agreements that were made without trust, and therefore we needed to put in place certain mechanisms, right? In the absence of trust. What do you think would be that factor in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war, especially if, for example, as you say, Ukraine has to make a pledge that it would stay outside of NATO? So what would be the factor? Because I don't think, and I think many people would agree with me, that the Ukrainians will have any trust that Putin would implement anything that's on paper.
I'm smiling because I often have people tell me, well, I can only negotiate with people I trust. You hear people say that. And I see Liz is smiling too, because I tell them, well, in my experience, I encounter some people whom I literally would trust with my life. I know they won't break a promise, and I know they'll tell me the truth. I meet other people, some of whom I have to do business with, that I don't trust at all. And then there's the great mass of people where I really don't know. And my own view of human beings is most of us try to be trustworthy most of the time. Other people are less than 100% trustworthy. I think any negotiator has got to be prepared to negotiate with people where there's uncertainty about the trust issue, particularly when circumstances change. And I think you've put your finger on a deeply, deeply difficult question. And that is, if on the one hand, a deal requires that Ukraine not be part of NATO, on the other hand, how can there be assurance that Russia, in fact, won't subvert a deal or violate it one way or another in the future? What kind of potential sanctions can be built in advance? What kind of assurances could be given? And there might be both carrots and sticks in this regard. But that is an incredibly important and serious issue. One thing is clear to me, although Ukraine, in my view, would not be a member of NATO, we have got to equip Ukraine so that they're well equipped to engage in self-defense. I mean, the West has to provide all kinds of both economic and military support for Ukraine in the years to come. Moreover, even if they're not a member of NATO, you could imagine that there could be security guarantees against a Russian invasion offered by some individual countries. But I think that's a terribly important problem. And, I think of course, who couldn't agree more with Liz and her organization that prevention is great, but prevention often involves, particularly with a regime that you think is evil or a leader that's a devil, deterrence. And the question of how you provide deterrence in terms of prevention is very hard, because often it will require sacrifices in advance, where there are trade-offs with economic interests. So it's—
But Bob, could you also, I mean, one of the things that I think would have to happen, we did this in Bosnia. We had a peacekeeping mission.
Oh, yes, of course.
That's what you would have to have here. You would have to have the UN. I know the OSCE was on the ground in the East. You would have to have an extensive peacekeeping mission there. And that's one of the ways that you could push back a bit, you're constantly identifying, where there's been violations. You have internationals on the ground that, obviously their governments would want protected. You could bring that information back to the UN. And I have to say, kudos to the UN that they did that General Assembly resolution when clearly it wasn't, anything was going to get done in the Security Council. And I don't think people realize how important that is. I think, sorry, I forgot the number, but I think, has there only been like 12 of those UN General Assembly resolutions? And so that's what I'm talking about prevention, is that we have to get tougher on UN General Assemblies. We have not had new peacekeeping missions in years. We have to be focusing in on prevention. And that's one of the ways that should be part of any negotiated settlement.
I agree that peacekeepers can be extremely valuable. And of course, the one remarkable thing that I think I read, about 120 nations are supporting Ukraine in terms of the world's nations. On the other hand, only half the world's population is supporting Ukraine, because India's not, Russia's not, some of the Middle Eastern countries are not. So it's, if you count heads, it looks good. But when you realize that, in terms of sanctions, with China and India not part of the picture, Russia has a lot of economic outlets.
But one thing we could do is get off oil. And that's a really key, that could also help our prevention.
Well, we ought to do that anyway. I mean, that's a little bit like saying we ought to get rid of poverty in America. Yeah. That might both help and bring peace, but it's a good thing to do. And I agree with you, but it's not so easy.
We're going to get back to that point. I almost want to wrap up here. I know we're a little bit over time, but I thought, both of you make such great points that we want to keep you on for a little bit longer. On that point on the peacekeeping force, the only issue would be, of course, Bosnia was very small, for example. Ukraine is huge. So who is going to foot that bill? Number one, as we also saw in Bosnia, there is the other not minor issue, but even if we have peacekeepers on the ground, that does not guarantee that we have peace. And so that is another major concern that we'll have to talk about at some point. On the point of oil that you raised, there's the energy issue. I'm just going to combine something that was said here by one of our audience members. While a military defeat of Russia is unlikely to happen, what role do international sanctions and the economy really play when it comes to forcing Putin to the negotiation table? Couldn't a deterioration of the economy, maybe even a complete breakdown, end the war, coerce Putin into withdrawing completely, and result in a peace agreement? And I think that's a really important question, because we often talk about, if we get involved with the war, would it escalate into a nuclear war and so on? But there is another option, and that's really to push much harder on the sanctions issue also, and to see what comes of it, if there's a big push internally in Russia. What do you think about that?
But that took a long time. We can go back to how, in theory, we ended the Cold War. We bankrupt with arms negotiation. With arms in the arms race. Eventually the Soviet Union was bankrupt. So yeah, but it's going to take a lot longer. I mean, you know, even though Russia has the economy about the size of Texas, it's contracted about 10 to 15%. You still have, you know, ways for them to make money. And, you know, you're right. I mean, the people that voted against or didn't vote for the UN resolution were countries in Africa that have significant ties to Russia, China and India, great examples. So, you know, it would take a really long time, you know, to bankrupt, to get Russia to a place, coupled with the fact how people have accepted the crackdown. You know, think about how far Russia had come and a lot of the freedoms they had. And you know, they're not getting any real other news. I mean, there's, you know, there's ways that it comes in. There's very, you know, people have been going on Yelp, for example, and leaving reviews on restaurants. There's very creative ways. And of course, it's harder with the internet now. You know, you can download different apps. But for the most part, you know, and again, we don't actually know how true this is, but, you know, support is holding in Russia. So.
Thank you, Liz. Those are great points. Bob, I'll give you the final word before I close off this session. Thank you so much.
Well, I think there is hope. I think that, in fact, a deal that does involve territorial concessions by Ukraine is extremely distasteful. And I think we should not in any way impose that deal on Ukraine. But I think in the long run, it would, if it were combined with Ukraine securing a genuine independence as a liberal, Western-oriented democracy, that would be a good outcome. And I think the tragedy is that I think ultimately, I think that's where it's going to end up, but I just hope it, if later, it's just going to people. So, but I don't think we might, I think we should not give up hope.
Can I just say one quick thing on that?
Please do, Liz.
So we'd also have to promise Ukraine that we would support them and, you know, put a Marshall Plan in there. And how do you do that when our governments, you know, and I'm talking about France, or I'm talking about the US or the UK, you know, are what's going to happen in the next election cycle? And so I think that that's a really important point as well. It's not, you know, it's not sure we're, you know, long-lasting allies.
Liz, I was hoping we'd end on that positive thoughts there from Bob, and then you came and poisoned.
No, I'm what Madeleine Albright said. I am an optimist, but a realist, and I worry a lot. And
I think that's really important. I came to the two experts to provide us with answers, and now I only go home with problems. But I do think you've given us a lot of thought about the issues that we need to think about. The last point in particular also, Liz, that you raised, again, it's so fundamental in terms of what President Zelensky will have to think about. Who is going to be the next US president? What is happening in terms of European politics? Where is it moving? How firmly is the Brussels holding in terms of the various member states? So thank you so much for making us think about these very, very difficult questions. It was a real pleasure to bring both of you to the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues, and thank you so much from LSE Ideas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's a pleasure meeting you by Zoom. I hope someday we can do it in person.
Yes, and Harvard is a member of the Alliance for Peace Building, and thank you so much for your positiveness. And that was very appreciated.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'll mediate between the two of you so we fix that, Liz. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.